And welcome to this event by SOAS's Influencing the Corridors of Power project, also known as ICOP. ICOP's aim is to create dialogue between students, academics, experts, and parliamentarians. We do this by sending out briefs to MPs, and we're about to launch an all-party parliamentary group very soon, so we can try to have an impact on important issues like prevent policy. ICOP is led by Professor Alison Scott Bauman, who was meant to be on the panel this evening, but unfortunately she's unwell. She sends her apologies. So tonight we're looking at the government's counter-extremism programme, Prevent, and asking if it criminalises us all. Just to contextualise things, I'm going to show you a short video clip which outlines the official position on Prevent.
What is the Prevent strategy all about? Prevent is one part of the government's counter-terrorism strategy. It aims to stop people becoming or supporting terrorists, violent extremists, or radicalising others. Prevent recognises that the radicalisation process can vary from person to person and can happen quickly or over a longer period of time. The Prevent strategy has a range of advice and support interventions that really do make a difference to millions of people every day. So how does radicalisation start? Often, it starts with an ideology that a person or group possesses. This ideology is then encouraged and developed in others so that they may adopt beliefs and views supportive of terrorism or forms of extremism leading to terrorism. There are three main types of extremist groups: ethno-national extremism, those who have a particular idea of what they want the nation to be like, which is often one culture excluding others; political extremism. A political extremist is someone whose beliefs fall outside mainstream values; religious extremism, a misinterpretation of faith in order to cause hatred and ignorance towards anyone else. How could someone be vulnerable to extremists? There is no profile for someone who could be drawn into terrorism, but factors may include a desire for political or moral change, feelings of grievance and injustice, a desire for excitement and adventure, a desire for status, a need for identity, meaning and belonging, feeling under threat, mental health issues, living through a significant life event. People who are vulnerable to becoming involved in terrorism can be any age, from any group, faith, ethnicity, or background. Spotting the signs can be difficult, and there is no one path a person goes down, but there are some signs to look out for. Being overly secretive about their online viewing and activities, this being one of the core ways in which radicalisers such as ISIS are known to communicate. Displaying feelings of isolation or expressions of an us and them mentality, a sign of sense of social isolation. Becoming more argumentative or domineering in their viewpoints, being quick to condemn those who disagree and ignoring the views that contradict their own. Losing interest in activities that they used to enjoy, distancing themselves from friends and social groups. Altered appearance, a change in style of dress and or appearance. Change of routine and travel plans. There's no single profile of someone who may be at risk of being drawn into terrorism. Radicalisation doesn't necessarily happen overnight. It is more likely to be a gradual process that happens over time.
Headlines I just want to show you, which illustrate the reality of Prevent for some, in these cases, all children. So I'm just going to give you a minute or so to have a quick look at these stories. Now, I also have a recording of the mother of an 11-year-old boy who was referred to Prevent. This happened after the boy was accused of saying he wished his school would burn down during a fire drill. And we're going to listen to his mother's voice. And thank you, Layla from Prevent Watch, for getting the recording for us.
My son was 11 years old when his then secondary school made a Prevent referral for something that my son had supposedly said. They had taken my son out of lunch, interviewed him, asked him leading questions, made him sign a statement, and didn't tell me that this was happening. That same night they made a Prevent referral, again without telling me. I found out through my son that something had happened, and it seems that they had made a Prevent referral based on one comment that my son had made. The context of all of this was my son was incredibly unhappy at this school. I had spoken to the head, the deputy head, and to his his form tutor, informing them that my son was really struggling to cope at this school. They did nothing about that, and of course my son then lashed out. They then made a Prevent referral. The investigating police officer closed the account with no further action taken, and it's coming up to a year and a half, almost 2 years, and we are still fighting to clear my son's police record. So my son now has a police record because I believe a teacher had racially profiled my son, heard a one-off comment, ignored the context completely, and made a Prevent referral. The last 2 years have been so incredibly difficult for my son primarily, and also myself and my family. I have no trust in that particular school, and we are still back and forth with the police trying to get my son's details cleared.
To discuss all this and more, I'm going to hand you over now to our host, Peter Oborne. Peter is an award-winning journalist and author. He was Chief Political Columnist for the Daily Telegraph until he resigned in 2015. He's written a number of books in which he identifies the power structures that lay behind political discourse. His latest book, Fate of Abraham, Why the West is Wrong About Islam, comes out next month. And in it, he outlines the dangers in the notion of a clash between Islam and the West. Peter has also written articles about the harm in the UK government's counter-extremism strategy. Peter, over to you.
Thank you very much indeed, Lena. It's a real pleasure to be here, and I was fascinated by that government bulletin about Prevent. Could you send me a link to it? It describes quite a lot of rather eminent people I know extremely carefully, particularly this inability to listen to another point of view, which is very sinister, actually. It's a manifestation of the new media political elite, actually, and I was absolutely entranced by that. By the way, I'm sorry that everybody describes me as an award-winning journalist. There's nothing more shameful for a journalist than to win awards. It's a scratch-my-back system whereby if you grovel and ingratiate yourself long enough to the bosses, they will generally fix you an award. And I'm afraid they did that for me. I apologize about that. I'm very, very keen, though, I was very keen to come to tonight's event because the timing is so remarkable. It comes in the wake of that 8-part podcast into the Trojan horse affair, which, of course, as I'm sure Professor John Homewood on my left will explain a little more, it was used as part of the background to a new counter-extremism strategy, and ahead of the keenly awaited review of Prevent, which I think is due. In fact, again, I would really like to know when it's coming. I imagine it was due in January, was it?
It was due in end of December.
It was due in the end of December. Of course, originally it was a chap called Lord Carlisle who they put in charge of it. But when they discovered that Lord Carlisle had actually set up the strategy and didn't think it needed any reviewing, Isn't that more or less a fair comment? They obviously had, that was a bit embarrassing. So they got somebody really neutral called Lord William Shawcross to review it instead. And in total, and you can't think of a more impartial figure. He's an old friend of mine, by the way, and he was very, very impartial. He's very, and so we can trust him. And therefore, we will look forward with keen expectation to his review of the PREVENT strategy. It certainly needs reviewing, but whether it'll be reviewed in the way it needs by William Shawcross, we will discover soon. And so we got that, and there's many other issues to discuss. And we've got a stellar, an award-winning panel even. Actually, on my left, we have John Haywood, who's not been given any awards for his most recent book on the Trojan Horse. In fact, he didn't even get reviewed for it. There were no reviews in the mainstream press. That's a very interesting fact. It's the sort of book which doesn't get awards. Now, think about that. Mull it over. On Tarek Younis, on the far left, who has done a lot of research into the racialisation of Muslims and counter-terrorism policies. And of course, on my right, Dr. Rizwan Sabir, who downloaded something from a US website and immediately this was a very bad thing to do, and got into trouble. So maybe I'll start with the suspect. You've written a book, Dr. Rizwan, about being a suspect, the counter-terrorism, Islam and the security state. We've just seen a video aligning the official PREVENT line. I was completely gripped by it. Is PREVENT an evidence-based strategy?
Excellent question to start off with. The evidence that is used to inform the PREVENT strategy is based upon one study that was conducted by two academics who were part of the National Offender Management Services, who devised 22 indicators that were to essentially be used in order to assess who a future terrorist was. So some of those indicators were used in that particular presentation, but some of them, for example, the desire to look for excitement, comradeship, or adventure. Now, I'm a pretty boring person generally, so I don't engage in such youthful activities, but a lot of young people do. But this is used as a suggestion of potential risk in the future. The other one, for example, one of the 22, is a political motivation to do something. So the idea that you becoming engaged in politics is then used to be indicative of future risk and threat. And this is actually a really important point, because prior to being, of course, wrongly arrested and detained by counter-terrorism police in 2008 for downloading a very routine document that was available in the library and W.H. Smith's, and is still available for £19.36. This particular document that led to my arrest and detention in solitary confinement custody, which I talk about in the book, The Suspect, even before actually that arrest happened, I was already on MI5's database or system. And I discovered this during the course of a legal case, which I eventually went on to win against the police for false arrest. But the reason for being on MI5's database was because of my political activism as a student in a pro-Palestinian capacity. That information about my pro-Palestinian activism was then used by the Crown Prosecution Service as I was sat crying mostly, but very, very, very stressed in my prison cell, to assess whether that should play a role in determining whether I'm a terrorist, and whether I should thus be charged for being a terrorist and probably remanded in a high security prison whilst awaiting my day in court before a jury of my peers. So the point that I'm making is But the evidence base that does exist when it comes down to prevent is, one, secretive, because the government has never allowed the study that is based upon those 22 indicators to be released into the public domain. We just have to take the word of these two academics. And secondly, the indicators are so broad so as to essentially encapsulate any person who is engaged in completely lawful, legitimate behavior, whether that is lawful and legitimate political activism that seeks to question and challenge power or dominant neoliberal forms of governance or economics. That includes left-wing activists, it includes pro-Palestinian activists, anti-austerity protesters, and of course, the elephant in the room, Muslims as well. So I would say that the evidence exists, but it's deeply, deeply troubling and secretive, so there is actually no way of interrogating it in any meaningful detail.
It also describes me when I was 21. I was any young person actually, they have grievances, they're concerned, have social concerns, they're thinking of going into politics, and rather wants a bit of adventure. I think it's quite extraordinary, very, very interesting. John Homewood, on the other hand, when you think about it, and I do understand, if I was, there is a perceived risk and a genuine risk of terrorism. Violent actions carried out by politically motivated people or troubled people who kill mass killings of civilians. It's happened in this country, it's happened all over the world. And it would be reckless of, absolutely reckless of any government whose primary focus is surely security of its citizens, not to try and minimise that risk. So doesn't prevent, isn't the first thing, isn't prevent needed, therefore?
Well, I don't think so. So if one takes what the evidence base for it is and how they constructed the typology of indicators, they were looking, it was based upon non-violent offenders within prison. That is, people who had indicated some interest in literature, downloaded material and so on that was related to violent extremism. And what the authors of the ERG-22 were looking at was the process by which they might move from being non-violent offenders to being violent offenders. So we're quite familiar with criminal justice system, prisons, having probation mechanisms, and so on. But Prevent is operating in a different space. It's operating in a space where no offence at all has been committed. Therefore, there can be no implication that individuals that are drawn into the Prevent overview are ever likely to commit any action. And indeed, you couldn't demonstrate any evidence showing the success of Prevent. Paradoxically, all you can show is the failure of Prevent. That is, a terrorist action has happened, therefore there must be a failure to have identified it earlier. Usually the failure is much closer to the events. That is, it's in relation to individuals who have come under the security services gaze. Many of those will have done so wrongly and incorrectly, but all the recent cases are of, Salman Abedi was on MI5's subject of interest. He wasn't followed up. The Fishmongers Hall was a former offender who should have been under the view of probation services and so on. None of these are related to Prevent. What Prevent is directed at is young children in schools. So 25% of people referred to Prevent are under 15. So the time lag is incredibly long. And nursery schools are subject to the Prevent duty, and children as young as 4 and 5 can be identified. You could say, well, there's no way in which they are being identified because they constitute any kind of risk at all. What they are is a means in to their families or other spaces. And back in 2011, you mentioned Lord Carlisle. There's a very chilling statement there about radicalizing locations. So what were the spaces that needed to be governed, the pre-crime spaces that needed to be governed? And they refer into there some ones that you might not be too surprised of: universities, campuses, and mosques, as well as private, more concealed locations such as homes. That's an extraordinary thing to identify as your target for prevent. And the only access to homes is, in a sense, through children. So the 11-year-old boy was being brought into prevent in order partly to monitor his parents. And that's why the parents couldn't be involved in the process of being told about it and so on, because it's not simply the boy who's under suspicion, but his parents who are under suspicion. So it's an incredibly frightening experience for anybody brought into it. And I think we've had that really vividly put for us in terms of the very recent and terrible experience of girl Q in the Hackney school, subjected to really stressful and disgraceful physical checks by the police. Well, that is prevent too. Obviously not physical examination, but that aspect of being taken aside and being subject to interview by police with nobody there to, no responsible adult, no parents told, and so on. And why? Because no offence has been committed, and therefore the police can intervene, prevent officers can intervene in that way. So I think it's correct to say that government is and should be rightly concerned with the protection of the public. But what this is about generating the anxiety in the public to have a policy which cannot be demonstrated to have any kind of success in making people safe, in order to create the illusion that the government is doing something.
I understand that, but so for many years I sat in the leader conference at the Daily Mail, and that's a place where people will, and I'm thinking of the cases which will be made by the highly intelligent columnists and op-ed writers, and they're saying, look, it's not like, you're going to get a crime, if you have a normal crime, somebody steals a car or shoots their wife or whatever it may be, that's going to be dealt with after the offence. Here you have somebody with a backpack full of explosives walking into a crowded supermarket or a pop concert to make some form of obscure point. And how do you? And he's never done it, or she has never done anything like that before. How do you identify it? Do you accept? And I'll ask this first of all to Tarek Younis. Tarek, do you accept we need a prevent strategy? I.e., there is something called a pre-criminal space. And you've got to fight, and the government has a duty to identify people who have never committed a crime before of any kind, who are nevertheless, that is the person who's going to walk into and do something terrible.
That's a very interesting question. I think it depends, first of all, on our discussion and our understanding of violence. I mean, if we bring out the recent femicide census, it revealed that in the UK, a woman is being killed, domestic homicide, not domestic abuse, domestic homicide, is being killed once every 3 days. So if we're speaking to the nature of violence, you just brought up an example of a very, very, very low probability event, right? Someone bringing in a backpack with explosives. Vis-a-vis, if we juxtapose that with the very real and everyday experience of domestic violence and domestic homicide, then clearly what we're seeing is a certain prioritization of certain violence over other forms of violence. And in fact, every discussion that we've been having about the ERG, you know, discussions of what leads men into...
So I ought to know, the ERG is...
It's the extremism risk guidance framework. Extremism risk guidance framework, the one that Rizwan just recently introduced. Yeah, the 22 indicators.
Yeah, this is the theoretical foundation.
Yes, exactly, the one that's based on secret evidence. So there's been long-standing research on, and discussions obviously, on what leads men to commit domestic abuse, you know, to be actually abusive at home. And isn't it fascinating that none of that research actually ever sort of translated into that sort of comprehensive public health strategy, whereby we are trying to identify men, you know, prior to them committing an act of violence. It's really odd, and I'll just bring in another counterexample. You know, what's interesting is that I think there was a recent study that had shown across the world, if there's any sort of association with violence, if we're speaking about some sort of behavior that's associated with violence, it's actually alcohol. Alcohol. Which is really interesting. I mean, you know, we can now conceive of so many other pre-crime, hypothetical pre-crime strategies, whereby anyone who goes out to consume alcohol is now under extreme surveillance to see what they're going to do afterwards, right? Again, that's not something we see and hear. So there's clearly some sort of political and racial.
So are you saying then, I mean, sorry, you're saying though that there are other problems which are greater, that, you know, that more people have, child murder is another example.
Yeah.
You know, where you can see maybe traffic accidents too, bring everybody down to 50 miles an hour. Are you therefore saying that we don't need a prevent strategy at all?
Well, that's actually really interesting, because also, how has prevent itself even sold the idea of its own necessity, right? If we ask ourselves how prevent sold its own necessity, it's through, you know, we call it the colonization of the future, right? It's colonizing the future with threat. It's saying that the threat is potentially everywhere at any time, and therefore, you know, we need to all do what we can, kind of the same logic that we see in the tubes here, you know, in London, see it, say it, sorted, right? So this notion of threat is in fact the selling point. It's not one of evidence-based, because the question which you just asked has to be flipped around. What is the evidence base inherently that prevent is even effective at what it's doing?
Different point. Now, see, sorry, there are two questions, right? Sure. And I think which I want to know the answer to, and the Daily Mail Leader Conference, which I represent this evening, will want to know the answer to. It will say, should we just, is prevent going to be scrapped, or is it going to be improved? I.e., we can accept that there are certain things it's doing wrong, and we can, you know, why on earth is it targeting children? But on the other hand, yes, there is this pre-criminal space which needs to be monitored, or that shouldn't be prevented at all. Which are you in?
Okay, so again, let's take it with the research. In the research itself, there was never any research that demonstrated, I used to consult for the police long ago. There was never any research that demonstrated that the Muslim community, now just focus on the Muslims, right, before we go ahead and expand the security apparatus towards every single political thought. The Muslims, there was never any research to demonstrate that the Muslims were not good at self-policing, that they themselves inherently, within the community, when they found any threat, that they wouldn't themselves take care of it. And I think that's very important for us to remember. In fact, the exact opposite was found, that not only were Muslims very good at self-policing, but we also know, for example, the 9/11 attackers, when they were in the United States, they were explicitly told, don't engage with the Muslim community there, because, you know, they won't provide you any support, right? So there's a lot of counter-examples to demonstrate that, in fact, there was no need to engage the Muslim community as a pre-criminal community, other than the moral panic, the sensationalized moral panic that the political class itself has manufactured.
I think what you're saying is don't like to put words in your mouth, but you're saying we don't need a prevent strategy at all.
Absolutely.
What?
Absolutely not. And I think we
And
could,
sorry, do you agree with that?
Yeah, but I have a slight caveat to add.
Yeah.
So I think the point of the pre-criminal space is that you are essentially complying with this deeply racist, orientalist conception that somehow being black, brown, or Muslim increases the risk that you will engage in violence.
So that's going to go down really well in the Daily Mail leader column.
No, I'm sure it will.
well, let's imagine that the Daily Mail leader group is actually themselves in the pre-criminal space, because they are. Because what
It's a
prevents...
very good case they are, by the way.
Yes, absolutely, and I'm going to demonstrate. And they realise they are, and they're mobilising against it, and they're mobilising against it through people saying, well, let's not treat right-wing extremism in the same way as we treat other forms of extremism. And we can expect that Shawcross might well come up with that view. So how does it work? Well, prevent is about the nature of people's ideas that may lead to other ideas, and those ideas may in turn become violent. That's the steps. And so you're intervening in the first step. Now, remember the government's little homily about prevent. It referred to ethno-nationalism. So views such as being opposed to foreigners, being hostile to immigration, and so on, are indications of the kind of view that prevent regards as extreme, legitimate, but extreme. And there are people with those views who engage in violence. Now, when the argument is placed in the context of Muslims or other sort of political groups, whether activism in relation to Palestine, Black Lives Matter, and so on, the judgment is it's legitimate to consider the legitimate views as risk factors in relation to the extremist violent views. So what has happened is, and you see it in Robin Simcox, the current interim commissioner for counter-extremism, says, no, we mustn't take that step because we would be, it would be a free speech issue if you actually treated those views as extreme and subject to prevent referrals. And that's what we should be careful of. So there's real care taken to keep the...
Can you clarify that? So Simcox, who's the counter-extremism, whatever that is, commissioner, he says, if you raise Palestinian issues, whatever you are potentially, whereas if you raise ethno-nationalist issues,
that you are potentially within the space of legitimate political opinion.
very interesting.
So that's the...
It just shows bias in favour
I think I
of
need
far-right
evidence of that.
narratives.
Are you not just expressing your own sort of prejudices?
No, I'm expressing the prejudices of Simcox, given that he's written about it. The first thing he did when he came into that, to the position of counter-extremism officer, was to put out articles saying we have to be careful that we don't treat legitimate right-wing views as if they are problematic. Now, the equivalent is, well, we mustn't then treat religious views as if they were problematic. So the equivalent position is, say, somebody says, well, I think I should live my life according to principles set out in my religion. It's a perfectly respectable thing. People have done that for centuries and argued it incredibly strongly. It's been the basis of a lot of politics. I mean, Methodists in Britain organising, class politics around their religious convictions. So religious convictions could not themselves be a problem unless they're the wrong kind of religious convictions. And what makes them the wrong kind of religious convictions is not their connection to violence, but simply their connection to the possibility of legitimate expression as part of British public and political life. So I think there is a very strong anti-Islam position within Prevent that becomes evident as soon as they try to distinguish right-wing extremism from what they call religious extremism, where both are seen as legitimate expressions, but one is going to have you in a prevent referral and the other is going to have you writing a leader column for the Daily Mail.
But it's also one specific type of white supremacist idea that's going to get you a prevent referral, and that is the vulgar racism of groups like the EDL or Britain First or whichever is the latest variant of the fascists.
That's very interesting. So how do they... So if you're...
Well, usually if you use the P or the N word, generally you're classified as a flagrant racist, and rightly so. However, if you express or articulate your disdain for people of colour or Muslims to say they're all terrorists, or you base it on a cultural othering process, that they're all security risks, that they're all grooming young white women, for example, or that they are potential terrorists, then that's the more acceptable form of discrimination against that other group. And that, I would say, is more dominant within the op-eds of the Daily Mail.
Let's give the one well-known case, which is the use by the Prime Minister
Yeah, exactly.
of particular language about ethnic minorities and religious minorities. Now, is that is that of interest to prevent or not?
No, absolutely not, because if it was of interest to prevent, Peter, it would require the immediate referral of the Prime Minister and probably most of his cabinet, in fact, most of the Conservative Party and UKIP,
quite a few
and
Labour,
thousands
yeah.
of others, and Labour as well, Tory light. But it would require thousands and thousands of interventions and referrals, which is why it's only the racism and the Islamophobia and the xenophobia of white working class communities that's being targeted rather than more respectable forms, which is articulated through recourse to vulgar but generally liberal language. Hence, recently, sorry, Tarek, I know you want to come in, there was a piece of research done at the University of Birmingham which showed how it was the actual middle classes from the more kind of affluent areas that articulated Islamophobia and racism, as opposed to working class communities. So, of course, the race dimension is absolutely critical and should never be overlooked or sidelined, but I think there's also a class dimension as well.
Sorry, you wanted to come in.
Yes, and I think Karim also has something to say, so I'll just mention something. One of the key words we're not saying is colorblindness. William Baldet, colorblindness. Yeah. William Baldet, who's one of the sort of the champions of prevent policy, he calls the prevent policy threat agnostic, which is what we saw in the video right now, that anyone here in this room, anyone watching, is equally susceptible to becoming radicalized if they're vulnerable enough and the ideological virus sort of enters your brain. And I think there's something here to say about colorblind strategies. Colorblindness is erasing or denying the significance of race when it matters. Now, we know counterterrorism itself as a field was inherently racist, but I think, moreover, there's also an intersectional dimension to this, which is very important, which we tend to also neglect. I know of a case example, for example, if we think about how racism operates, we can now make the links between, let's say, the war on drugs, and if anyone is interested in how colorblind policies actually perpetuate, and in fact, you know, they make things so much worse, then I highly recommend the book, The New Jim Crow by Michelle Alexander. But I think it's really important to emphasize here that, you know, a Somali youth walking in the streets of London may be caught by the police. This is a real example. May be caught by the police, obviously, given that he's racialized as black, and he's far more likely to be caught by the police and stop and search. But then when they find a knife on him, and they also find out he's Muslim, then they make a prevent referral. Right? And so there's these overlapping ways in which racism operates, which we've been really denying. And I think this difference in threshold is what we're really talking about. I think it's really important for all of us to remember, when we're saying something is racist, we're not saying white people don't get caught, right? That's really important to emphasize. We're saying the difference in thresholds vis-a-vis the sort of examples that Riz and John have mentioned, that, you know, explicit emphases of ideological sort of relations to prescribed groups among white people vis-a-vis so many examples of racialized Muslims who, I know an example in my research of someone who was referred to prevent because they came from the Middle East and they weren't even Muslim, right? And if there's no other indication of how racist a policy can be, then that's one of them, but I'm sure Kareem can probably add more.
So the point I just wanted to make very quickly,
of course.
It's okay, is...
Can you tell us who you are, sir? Sorry.
Kareem, I'm a friend of
Yeah.
everyone on the panel and a fan of everyone on the panel too. These three the most, to be honest. Of course, I love your work also, especially on the Israel lobby. But the point I wanted to make is just to grasp the scale of threat inflation that we're talking about. So Chris Hunter, one of the government's experts on terrorism, stated that you have 1 in 16 million chance of being anywhere near an act of political violence in this country. Frank Harvey in the United States stated that you are 4 times more likely to be struck by lightning, 13 times more people die from homicide. Baroness Varsi, the former deputy head of the Conservative Party, actually said that less than 0.1% of British Muslims have had anything to do with terrorism. Now, in addition to that, when we look, Damien Breen has a great book on this, when we look at the attribution of Prevent funding during a certain period from 2008 to 2014, we see that the funding was delivered to places on the basis of what proportion of their population was Muslim. Okay, so now just to grasp the level of threat inflation that we're talking about, at the same period, according to EU statistics, 0.7% of all terrorist attacks which happened in EU countries during that time were carried out by people who said that they were Muslim. Now, in terms of an alternative to prevent, the existing duty of care in public institutions says that if I, as an educator, hear someone saying they are about to go and do something which harms someone else, I have the legal duty to then pass that up in a different place. What we're really getting to the grips of is how this threat inflation has produced an industry which is essentially about ideological policing. That's the key, really, I would say.
Let's move it on to the trade. That's really interesting. So what you're, yeah, I mean, I accept the point that you are amazingly unlikely to go and bomb. It's a very much smaller problem than people than the
One last
perception.
Point. So, sorry, just one last point. And when talking about the Conservative Party, Professor Danny Dorling from Oxford University collated around 130,000 deaths pre-pandemic due to austerity in this country.
Yeah.
You are statistically more likely to be killed by austerity at the hands of the Conservative Party than by terrorism.
Actually, I think you're getting a bit. I think you're getting too political here. To be honest, I think we've got to have a discussion of prevent, not anti-detestable. Anti-conservatism or pro-Labour or whatever. I think we ought to keep it to prevent. John Homewood, you gave evidence during the Trojan horse case. Can you tell us about the connection between the Trojan horse affair and prevent? And maybe you could just briefly, just for the audience, summarise very briefly what happened in Birmingham.
Well, what happened in Birmingham was that nothing happened in Birmingham other than an attack upon successful schools and the programme of school improvement, particularly associated with the dramatic improvement of the school performance of Muslim children in inner city areas. So it's an extraordinary success story that got converted from something that should and was in fact celebrated in 2010 as the success of schools in Birmingham became what Michael Wilshaw then described as the awful schools in Birmingham. What was so awful about them was that they achieved outcomes above the national average for pupils from ethnic minority backgrounds, and particularly Muslims. So what happened was that one of the ways in which the schools brought about improvement was through the integration of the culture of the home with the culture of the school. That is, recognizing the culture of the pupils and allowing pupils to bring, as I put it, their whole self into school. That is, to be Muslim in school, have their culture and religion recognized within the school, and that was then tied to a program of academic success. But this was taking place in quite difficult political circumstances where the government was seeking to take schools away from local authorities. This was Michael Gove's big policy against the blob, which was against both local authority education departments, against teachers, and in order to promote academies. So the takeover of schools, which no journalists ask, could only be a successful school taking over an unsuccessful school. And it could only take place because the government was actively encouraging it to take place. By active encouragement, I mean officials from the Department of Education being present at all the meetings in which the takeovers were taking place, i.e. turning up to the governor's meetings, approving the introduction of the best practice from the good schools in Birmingham. So the two schools, Old Now, outstanding. Parkview, outstanding. That's the story. And it's not though, only a story of Muslim governors. So the head teacher at Parkview, which is a fact that's kept well out of things when the story is of brown conservative men doing terrible things in the school, was a white feminist teacher, atheist teacher, who had been at the school for 16 years, delivering the program alongside Tahir Alam, was due to retire and was dragged from retirement through the courts to be accused of actions that undermined the well-being of children that she'd devoted her career to. So it's a truly terrible story. And it becomes, it's a story of extremism. So the Department for Education's due diligence and counter-extremism unit is all over the process and so on. But no teacher gets accused of extremism. No governor gets accused of extremism. After the extremism dies down, it becomes undue religious influence. But nobody can say, well, what undue religious influence is. Schools are required to teach religious education. They're required collective worship. It became a problem of Islamic collective worship at the schools, and yet the schools had what's called a determination, that is illegal. They'd gone through a legal process that allowed collective worship in schools. Most or a lot of schools don't bother with collective worship. I'm an atheist. I don't particularly care about collective worship. And lots of white British parents are like that. But you don't go for a determination to have Islamic collective worship in order to not have collective, in order to ignore collective worship. So you have the paradox that if you apply for a determination, you're almost by definition going to appear more religious than schools which ought to be doing collective worship and are not bothering. So you had this movement of teachers between going into this sort of thinking, this is very odd what's going on here. There's all this serious collective worship taking place in assembly. I've never seen anything like it. It must be wrong. That flame is fanned by humanists in Birmingham who know perfectly well that every one of these schools has a determination and is not doing anything illegitimate. It's just doing things that Humanists UK don't agree with. So you had this huge moral panic around it that fed into Michael Gove's predilections at the Department for Education, and it was also, in a sense, pointing the finger directly at his programme, the programme of academy schools, because no other school can be taken over by one school taking over another school. That's the academy's programme. Otherwise, they're just schools within the local authority, and the local authority is responsible for them, and it's a normal local process of review.
John, can I just very briefly just say, how did this connect this with prevent? And then we'll widen it a bit.
Well, I'd say the 2011 prevent strategy, which you mentioned, Lord Carlisle, is flagging up the issue of ungoverned spaces and the need to take prevent and a greater security agenda into them. There was no prevent requirement on schools, no prevent duty within schools. It happened to be the case that many schools did consider prevent, and as Tarek said, particularly schools in Muslim areas were concerned about issues of radicalisation, and so the Birmingham Trojan Horse schools actually had more prevent engagement than other schools. But what this was used for was to bring in Prevent 2015, which is what we're really talking about today, and that is the extension of the prevent duty over all public authorities, a situation in which over 1 million people, according to the Home Office data, 1 million people are trained in prevent surveillance techniques. And a large number of those are active in schools in England. And when Rizwan said the Birmingham study showed that the middle class is more Islamophobic than the working class, well, it's the middle class who are the practitioners of prevent on a day-to-day level. So you have both a middle class, I would say, let me say, distaste for working class families, added on to a distaste for religious minority families as well. So I think it can only happen in working class schools, and working class schools of primarily Muslim pupils.
But then, was it specifically cited, Trojan Horse, as a reason for the 2015?
Absolutely. It was the only example that they gave, that 5,000 children at risk in Birmingham.
Do you want to engage?
I want to just qualify one point to what John just said, because I think the takeaway point, I agree with everything that was said, just the takeaway point almost made it that it was middle-class families against, or sort of positioning against religious families. But I think there's a particular moral panic that's inspired by Islam and Muslims especially, right? And I think it's always really important to emphasize that because it's not just about religion, though there's obviously, I'm sure Humanists UK and others have certain logics or maybe logical acrobatics that they're engaging maybe to avoid any charge of Islamophobia. But Muslims and Islam have a long historical trajectory in the global north of being sort of placed on the boundaries of the Western world, right? And I think there's a point there which, we can trace that historical trajectory well into the, colonial projects of, how Muslims need to be managed, or else they get too angry, and fanaticism, etc. So there's historical trajectory here. It's not just religious faith, but there's something particular about Muslims on the boundaries of European imagination.
So, Rizwan, you also have had. Tell us about your experience with the prevent strategy.
I know time's up, so I'm going to keep this answer very brief.
5 minutes.
5 minutes.
Oh, yeah.
I promise
in that
to take...
case, anybody in particular, anybody from the audience want to answer?
We're going to do Q&A after 5 minutes.
Oh, we are, right. Yeah.
I will literally take 60 seconds to answer this question. My arrest, detention, investigation, and continued surveillance for many years, and what will stay on the system for 99 years, was not a prevent intervention. It was preemptive in the sense that before I had done anything even remotely criminal or untoward, I was arrested, detained, investigated, and the rest is history, they say. But what the significant thing about the case was, and how it connects to Prevent, is after the arrest and my release without charge, there hasn't been an arrest on campus for the possession of documentation, legal or illegal. But there have been Prevent referrals where you've had individuals, noted case studies like Staffordshire University, for example, where a young Muslim male student was reading a book by American psychologist John Horgan, and I can't remember the other author's name, he'll have to forgive me. But point is that the arrest brought in the fanfare of media and criticism. And I think power learns very quickly from resistance and critique and question. And they realize that actually if we are to go away and influence and impact people and try and ideologically control what they're reading and not reading, we can't go in guns blazing with 26 officers, codenaming an Operation Minerva and arresting someone. Instead, let's embed the preemptive logics of counter-terrorism within a strategy called Prevent. Let's embed it within the Counter-Terrorism Security Act, i.e. law, and then compel public sector workers, teachers, educators, doctors, nurses, opticians, even taxi drivers, to report and refer people before they go on to do something, thus never drawing attention of the media and the publicity that an act of state violence incorporates. So
It's
the
not
way...
just an act of state violence. I think you should say a state suppression.
Yeah, but...
I mean, they arrested you for something, but it's not state violence. I think you should be...
No, it's an act of state violence.
Right.
I would say an
Were
act
you
of...
beaten up? Were you hit?
No, but you're interpreting violence too literally here. You're being... Forget it. It's too literal. It's too literal, Peter. You've got to look at violence not only as an act of physical abuse, but also psychological coercion and something that seeks to deter and damage the way you think about something as well. So yeah, I would definitely maintain that definition of state violence.
So you want some...
That's longer than 60 seconds, but...
I know, it's a bit... we're opening it up to the floor, are we?
Yeah, just before... We're going to do an audience Q&A, but I just wanted to invite Loki to speak for a couple of minutes, because Loki, as well as being SOAS alumni and a rapper, is also a big activist on this issue. So, yeah, it'll be nice to share your thoughts with us.
Thank you very much. So I would really recommend that everybody reads Ridwan's book, by the way, because it goes into excruciating detail about his experience, and really through that micro, you can understand the macro in a very important way. I'm going to speak very, very briefly. I don't want to take up too much time. There is, alongside Prevent, a program being rolled out in British schools called Solutions, Not Sides, and I think it's really important that people have an awareness about this organisation, what it does and what's behind it. I've been investigating it for several months, and it is now officially part of the Prevent rollout across the country. This is an organisation which has had 4 employees simultaneously employed by the Israeli government, at least 28 employees who are former IDF personnel and Israeli intelligence. The funding of the organisation is also interesting. Trevor Chin is one of the funders. There are several other funders who share funders with the Builders of Settlements, with the Friends of the IDF, and also the Conservative Party. This organisation has its roots in something called One Voice, which came out of Oslo as a way to export normalization, basically. It's an anti-BDS vehicle which is acting through the Prevent duty in this country, which has obtained funding not only from the US State Department, but also from the British government. I can expand more, but I understand that there is not a huge amount of time. What I would just suggest for everyone is to look deeply into Solutions, Not Sides. It has been defeated in some of the schools. There have been mobilization by parents and and students against it. Obviously, Gavin Williamson, around the last round of sort of spectacular violence in Palestine, he wrote a letter to schools across the country urging them to use solutions, not sides, to help explain the Israel-Palestine issue. And yeah, as I say, it has large funding from local councils as well. There's a lot that we could talk about with the organization, but literally the head of communications for the organization in 2014 was simultaneously the head of communications for the Minister of Justice in the Israeli state. It has had employees who were simultaneously employed by the Israeli embassy. The social media manager of the IDF was simultaneously working for this organization. It's pretty dangerous to think that school children, and particularly it's clearly targeting Muslim communities. It's disproportionately placed in communities that have a higher proportion of Pakistani and Muslim students. So yeah, it's a major issue that needs to be looked at. But I understand that in the wider question of prevent, this may not be necessarily completely apt, because it seems at the moment we're stuck in kind of debating the sort of philosophical basis of prevent and stuff like that. We need to look at it also as a vehicle for other things.
Thank you, Loki. In fact, as you touched on sort of the international side of things, I think one of the questions was actually about prevent being exported abroad. So maybe just before we go to the audience for Q&A, can I put that issue to the panel and see if there's anything you can tell us about prevent in terms of, does the British government implement this programme elsewhere, or is it just a UK-based programme?
Yeah, I mean, I've just been reading a book, actually, by Sean Roberts about the Chinese oppression of the Uyghurs and how it appears that RUSI, the very respectable organisation, the Royal United Services Institute, went to China in 2016, I think, to talk about prevent strategies, counter-extremism. I think that's right, which is, given that the oppression was well underway, I think. Do any other panelists want to talk? Oh, then I can see there's lots.
I just think because one thing that we came up with when Layla and I were doing the People's Review of Prevent was looking at the issue of the export of Prevent, and particularly because the United Nations had expressed concerns about counter-terrorism policies generally, and there were views being expressed that actually there was no need to have counter-terrorism policy during the period of Northern Irish troubles. So why suddenly do we have a plethora of counter-terrorism actions? People may not be aware, but there's no prevent in Northern Ireland, and the reason why there's no prevent in Northern Ireland is not because there's no risk of terrorism in Northern Ireland, but there's no risk that prevent would be acceptable to the population because of the division in Northern Ireland. So it does require a minority to be scapegoated rather than, in a sense, two, let's say, more or less equally presented, divisions. But one of the things that was really interesting was when we contacted the UN about the things that we were doing in the Prevent Review was the Special Rapporteur for counter-terrorism policy at the UN was incredibly keen for us to put forward the idea of the risks inherent in the export of Prevent and wanting that to be a key feature of what we were putting forward, precisely because it was facilitating authoritarian governments elsewhere. We were saying, well, it's facilitating an authoritarian government here, but yes, that aspect is both authoritarian domestically, but really problematic when exported. And the UN, Putin's Russia was one of their major areas of concern, the way in which the language of counter-terrorism was being used against domestic opposition.
It's a familiar refrain around the world, isn't it? To denounce your legitimate political opponents as terrorists is a very familiar device. Does anybody want to ask a question? Yes,
And
the
if you
lady
can
in the
just
front.
wait till we bring the mics over.
Oh, yeah.
Thank you.
I'm going to go in about 10 minutes. My book is got to go to press tomorrow, and I've got to deal with the proofs. I've nearly dealt with them all, but it's got worse and worse. And so with any apologies, Nina, I might ask somebody to take over the chair. I just apologise, but I must go. It's called Fate of Abraham. It's published by Simon & Schuster in the middle of May, and it's incredibly good.
I can endorse that.
Thank you very much.
Okay, well, thank you very much for your comments today. Less so questions, more so comments that you might want to respond to, and a couple of facts as well. Right after the Prevent policy was introduced, the Home Office decided to remove forced marriage and female genital mutilation out of their violence against women and girls strategy and move it towards their Prevent strategy. Now, I sat on Home Office stakeholder meetings for both issues for about 4 years as part of their youth engagement and participation, and they never offered a single valid reason for those two issues in particular, to be moved. And the only conclusion that we could draw as those sort of community stakeholders was the fact that the demographics affected by those two issues were overwhelmingly black and minority ethnic, and they were overwhelmingly Muslim. So you've got very concrete examples of how Prevent was used to target specific communities. From a local authority perspective, from Waltham Forest, the data that came out of their Prevent cases indicated that of all of the cases that were referred to Prevent, the only ones that were moved up the chain, so to speak, and were actually progressed were the cases of either Muslim children or black and minority ethnic children, whereas the white children that were referred to Prevent on the basis of right-wing extremism, their cases were not referred onto the next level. So we're talking about the fact that this is not just a national policy, but local authorities are also complicit in ensuring that black and minority ethnic children are disproportionately affected by something that was designed to target them anyway. Your comments about the the violence against women and domestic violence in general being more prevalent but not being tackled in the same way. After the Sarah Everard case, our London Mayor, Sadiq Khan, referred to it as did he say a pandemic, or did he say, he referred to it as an epidemic of male violence against women and girls. I would actually call it a pandemic of male violence against women and girls, because 1 in 3 women globally are murdered by their partners every single day. And we have not had a holistic public health response to tackle those issues. Much in the same way as you've mentioned, we have copious amounts of research to indicate why this happens, and yet this has not been acted upon. So the disproportionate emphasis on counter-terrorism measures versus things that actually kill women and girls on a daily basis is also evident.
I think it's really questions to be battled. Is that, I don't know what the form is, Nino. What's it? Yeah.
I mean, if they want to respond to any of the comments that I've made, absolutely. The final comment would be about British values, which also came hand in hand with the Prevent policy. Now, we can't deny or ignore the fact that by saying this is a list of British values and anything that goes against that means that you're not British, doesn't other children that have different experiences, and also when they're questioning examples of colonialist teachings in schools. So, for example, if you come from India or Pakistan, where you've experienced partition and decades of British colonial rule, and you express dissatisfaction or disagreement with that, and then that being referred to as being anti-British and not in line with British values, effectively others these children in an institution where they're supposed to be safe.
I'm going to stop. Is it the case that if you express dissidence about British colonial practice of the kind this lady here is referring to, that one is liable to be reported to the Prevent for objecting to the slave trade or, say, the Amritsar massacre or whatever.
It's actually in the document. So if you look at actually Prevent policy documents, they specifically outline grievances. Among the grievances, they do mention issues with Western foreign interventions.
Sorry?
Along those lines, they specifically mention Western foreign interventions. Now, of course, that can be understood very broadly, but specifically, it's a very racialized connotation of, people here within this community who have an issue with foreign policy, both historic and contemporary. And we've seen examples of that. So, I mean, this is something that's actually written, it's black on white in policy documents. I think
like to see that.
John would, you had something else to add?
Yeah, right. I just agree entirely with what is the policies that, I think it is incredibly important to have policies around sexual violence, harassment in schools and so on, and to be teaching in relation. It doesn't have to be through Prevent. It can be just the normal processes of how a school addresses different forms of bullying and harassment. What is striking is, and because it came up in the Birmingham Trojan horse case, Michael Wilshaw's grammar school, Mossbourne, had a policy of no physical relationships, no physical touching within the school. Parkview had the same policy. Parkview's policy was Muslim policing of personal relationships. Mossbourne's policy was a good policy around the protection of, protection from sexual harassment. So it's so there is a double standard, and it was, at one point, one of the accusations put to the teachers at Parkview was that they didn't respect the right of young people to have a kiss and cuddle behind the bike sheds. That was literally what the lawyer from the NCTL put forward. And you think, well, this is, so trivial. But at the same time, the Women's and Equalities Committee in the All-Party Committee in the House of Commons was urging policies towards harassment and sexual bullying within schools, and the government was refusing to introduce, and still hasn't introduced them.
If I may also just add one thing, and I'll try to say this very briefly, because there's many different ways we can approach this, and you hit the nail on the head from a different approach, which we rarely ever talk about, which is if you look at how Islamophobia has developed across the global north. It used to be pre-9/11, and I remember this very clearly. The Muslim question always existed. What's the role of Muslims? How are Muslims going to integrate into Western liberal societies? Has been a mainstay for decades, right? If not longer, obviously. What the war on terror has done effectively, and you said it so well, is that what used to be, you better integrate or get the hell out of our country, has become you better integrate or now you're a potential security threat, right? The point of integration, as what David Cameron called it, muscular liberalism, right? This point of integration has become securitized through counter-extremism. And that experience that you had is, you saw it live. You saw it live happen, how this long-standing question of forced marriage and among other things, right? Suddenly got shifted, and that's not only here in the UK. Same discussions are happening in Denmark, in Quebec, and everywhere else, which speaks to the global phenomenon of the war on terror and the global question, of the global Muslim question, at least in the Western world, or in the global North, of how the war on terror has inherently shifted the entire discussion of integration towards security.
I'm just going to replace Peter for a while. Apologies, he had to leave to catch a train. I think we'll take a couple more questions. We've got one up here, and then we're coming to the end. So if you can just be as brief as possible, please.
Yeah, I have a question. So, writers like Harsha Walia have kind of spoken about how programs like Prevent are kind of part of a broader kind of testing of surveillance systems prior to their expansion for a more kind of securitized state and kind of the kind of growth of that kind of function of border guards in civil society and beyond. Do you see that kind of as a logical conclusion, or is, I don't know, yeah, forget that bit. I mean, I suppose with kind of things like the Nationality and Borders Bill, do you see that kind of expanding further? And then kind of on the counter of that, in terms of the resistance to that and in terms of the alternatives that you suggest or that you acknowledge, like, and even resistance to that, do you feel that there is kind of hope to be taken from resistance? I know Loki mentioned the kind of mobilization of parents and students against this within schools. Do you take any kind of hope from any particular kind of movements that are fighting against Prevent on the ground, or do you feel it needs to be fought at state level?
That's a really excellent question. I'm sorry, half of it I've already forgotten, so I'll do it in reverse. I think this is part of the resistance. I think having these conversations, putting onto record the harms that are emerging from these particular policies, which are oftentimes constructed to be victimless and largely harmless, centering the stories of survivors, as you saw at the beginning of this session, as Prevent Watch has put out in the People's Review of Prevent, John's work, Layla's work. These are all examples of the resistance, which, to be honest, has thrived over the last decade and compelled power and government to largely encapsulate or incorporate the whole idea that on the far right of the political spectrum, and thus we are now extending it to that particular community, which just triggers my memory and what you asked. And that is that, yes, historically, people of color or the natives in the colonies were oftentimes the lab rats. In fact, there is a story running in the press today, I think, which said that there was, or yesterday, that there was an individual detained in a CIA black site who was used essentially as a lab rat for individuals to practice torture on. And I think we can broaden that out and have a look at how those tactics that have been used historically in the colonies against racialized people, then brought home, sort of home to the north of Ireland, or applied, let's say, to white communities, and then applied again to diaspora racialized communities in the UK, and now even to white working class communities. So I think historically we've always been used as guinea pigs, and now we can see that happening even more in a really vulgar way. And this, I think, is the essence or the moral of the story, and that is that resistance to Prevent is not just my problem as a Muslim who believes in the dismantling of this particular policy. Unfortunately, Peter's gone, so I can't tell him that that's my view on the matter, but it's not just my job. Yeah, I am my community is at the top of the threat radar, so to speak, but actually it's also left-wing, white, young children articulating any form of resistance or dissent in the classroom about eco-terrorism or another topic around anti-neoliberalism that are also the target. So actually, the resistance needs to encapsulate all communities coming together and working together on this in order to make sure that we can all actually still claim to live in a free, democratic society, because under the Prevent strategy, we don't. And I think that's the key point to take from this. Thanks.
Thank you. We had a question down here from someone. Okay.
My question is for Professor Homewood. The People's Review of Prevent report. Now, I'm having this issue where I'm putting in FOIs for Prevent data and getting Section 24, which is a national security risk, constantly. Was there any way that you managed to overcome that and getting any data from the councils of the government?
I would say persistence and completely by accident. So since 2015, the government has refused to say what the Prevent priority areas are. I think we did over 300 FOIs to try and find out what they were. And then by accident, one person replied with a list of all the Prevent priority areas. That wasn't supposed to happen, but it did. And on that basis, we can show. I mean, using 2011 census data, 3/4 of Muslims in England live under a prevent priority area, compared with 1/3 of the population as a whole. So that's, in a sense, the special focus. And of course, living in a prevent priority area elicits prevent responses and prevent engagement. So that's, if you like, the discrimination that's inherent to it. And I want to answer the question about the politics. I think we have a very dangerous politics in England, and I'm going to say it very specifically, England, highly centralised and with a whole set of activities removed from the ability to have direct influence. So government talked at the same time as, introducing Prevent about the big society. The big society was your community can run schools and so on. What that did was take schools out of local authorities, which meant that local parents have very little power in relation to the school, the organisation of the trust. And we see that in London Academy of Excellence and so on, that councillors engaging there can't engage through the political process of the local authority. It's under the central control of the Department for Education, Commissioner for Education or Regional Commissioner for Education, Trust. There is no democratic involvement in it. And why that matters is, I think it's not the case, I lived in Scotland for a long time, and I know it's as capable, of Islamophobia as anywhere else. But all-party group of politicians in Scotland has called for the removal of Prevent. So that's the difference, that the way in which local groups, local organisations connect to the national body, in this case a devolved assembly, gives some power to affect political change. In England, we're actually living in a highly centralised system, and one of the consequences of a centralised system is, I think, populist politics directed against scapegoats. So it's no accident that we've got mini-Trumpism in England and much greater engagement with communities in both Scotland and Wales as a consequence of the assemblies. So we're in a difficult political position, I think.
Do we have any more questions?
Hi.
Okay.
I hate public speaking, so my heart is like pounding. So bear with me. So I've been interested in CVE for quite some time. So I've seen like Moonshot CVE, they do like the redirect method, but I haven't found any sort of examples of ethical and effective CVE. So like you said, it's before anything happens. Are there actually any ethical ways that protect people's rights to privacy, freedom of speech, that can prevent people having certain ideas and then escalating it into a view that it's necessary to commit violence, but also protecting them and not intimidating them? And are there actually any examples of ethical, effective CVE?
There was research done in the United States that showed already, I think that speaks to the point of what Prevent is actually destroying, which is trust within the Muslim community. And that's something we haven't really spoken about. I think prior to 9/11, there probably wasn't that much research. There was no interest in looking at that, right? I mean, there was some research previously that showed that Muslims were good at self-policing and would engage at that point of, oh, someone's about to commit an act of violence, right? Anecdotally, as someone I've grown up sort of always engaging with the Muslim community, and I come from a family of activists who've always engaged in different ways. I mean, historically, it's always been something that's always been just dealt with internally, right? And someone shares strange views, and we deal with them, et cetera. And it only comes to that point of trust that they feel like, oh, I can share this, and I'm not in a mosque where there's a giant red poster that says, if someone says something weird, call counter-terrorism police. And that sounds like a joke, but that was actually the very first mosque I entered here in the UK had that giant red poster that says that, which is very different to my experiences in Germany, in Denmark, in Canada, and other places. So I think you know, history has no control group, right? We can't go back to a pre-securitized time, right? And that's the reality that we live in right now. I think to answer your question very explicitly of what we have to do to move forward, we have to recreate these safe spaces. And I think especially Muslim groups, NGOs, charities have to be explicitly anti-prevent, right? And they have to really position themselves as such to create that safe space where now people feel like they can come and engage. And just as, also as a psychologist, I often right now even get non-Muslims who come to me and say, you know, I want to speak with you just because I'm concerned of going to the NHS. One thing we haven't really spoken about is specifically how prevent as a public health strategy is being psychologized, right? So now mental health settings have a very particular policing role right now, which we haven't spoken about whatsoever. But now think about that safe space element. I mean, if you think about, you know, if you have a youth who has violent thoughts, you know, where would that hypothetically in a perfect liberal capitalist society, where would he take those thoughts? To his mental health professional. Well, they're not going to do that anymore, right? Now knowing that prevent operates under those settings, right? So prevent is actually really doing the exact opposite of what it wants to achieve, and really the future comes into, you know, now having to explicitly take positions that are very politically, salient to say we're anti-prevent. You know, this is a safe, secure space where you can share your thoughts, and that's okay.
Sorry, so can I say, you think that the creation of safe spaces and,
Yeah.
So this is what I've been thinking, so the creation of safe spaces would be the most, and addressing grievances and the creation of safe spaces would probably be the most effective way to discourage people from feeling that violence is necessary.
Yeah, I mean, I think that's just one part of it. I mean, I think there's a lot more parts, and I'm sure others have more to say to this. I mean, I think inherently creating a community of suspicion, that's already highly problematic, right? I mean, the fact that Muslims themselves have positioned themselves. Remember, Islamophobia creates this good Muslim, bad Muslim binary, whereby, you know, the good Muslim way to act is to condemn terrorism, etc., to call on the police if someone says something strange. It's created this environment that promotes that form of suspicion among ourselves before anyone actually even enters into any other conversation with anyone, right? And we see that on the ground. I mean, you know, one of the stories, I've spoken to so many people sort of impacted by Prevent, but one story I'll just say in a nutshell, was a 17-year-old girl, a Muslim woman, who told me that for years she's withheld sharing anything political. She's 17 for years. Remember, silencing is not simply the absence of words, right? This is an affect, this is an experience of suffocation. And inherently, that's the thing that we have to really work towards removing and counterbalancing. So I don't think we should focus. I think an element in your question, which I'm not saying you're saying it this way, but an element of your question is how do we address the individual so that we can prevent the individual from going that direction? I'm telling, my response is actually our intervention has to be at the communal level, right? And then the individual sort of responses will develop from that.
Yeah, can I say, because I think it's paradoxical that the problem isn't of the Muslim community. The Muslim community is the answer. The problem is in relation to right-wing extremism, where there is no community that could be the answer. So if you think, if you think of the what might be the solution to a young, disaffected Muslim youth is talk to lots of people, engage them with mosque, with other organizations and so on. And actually, if they fall away, that becomes a worry for people. So that's how the process of community and trust works. What's the equivalent in relation to right-wing extremism? Just think of the case of, I've forgotten his name, but in Lincoln, where the judge could come up with nothing better than reading Jane Austen. And that's because he couldn't say, well, why don't you join your Methodist youth group and church? Why don't you attend, your local church and so on? That really doesn't exist. So there is a real crisis of community, and it's a crisis of community produced by particular kinds of neoliberal policies, created by austerity, and so on. There's hardly any investment in youth work. The main investment in youth work is prevent. I mean, we don't invest in our young people for their own sake, for who they are, and for developing their sociability with each other. We've become scared of sociability, and that's the psychologizing of of how prevent operates. The problem is the individual. Well, the problem is the absence of lots of people to talk to who are going to, who are going to engage and so on. And some of that's going to be unruly, but that's what the public sphere, should be about. We need more voices in the public sphere in order to be able to counter violent voices, not fewer voices. And that's I think, the problem.
Thank you, John. Just very quickly, Rizwan, did you want to add something before we wrap up?
This time it will be literally 60 seconds. But if you look at what CVE seeks to do, and that's to counter ideology, that religious ideology, that is based on an assessment that the threat that confronts Western nation states is rooted in religious ideology. That is a depoliticized reading of the threat. Why were kids from Leeds, Bradford, London, Birmingham, whatever, not blowing up tubes and trains prior to the 2003 invasion of Iraq, right? So I think recognizing the politics of the entire situation allows an ethical conversation to emerge. And I think the solution to this is not individuals, but it's actually creating a more inclusive society, one which accepts and welcomes a difference of opinion, a difference of viewpoints, but more importantly, it allows people to express themselves. Half of the time, I can't say the stuff that I want to say. This is about as passionate as I'm going to get in a public space. And the reason is because I will immediately be written off as being some crazy person. So unless you create a space which allows and accommodates for radicalism, right? Because there's enough discourse and evidence to show, 30 seconds, that you create an environment that is conducive to terrorism when you exclude and marginalize people because they recognize that the system cannot be altered or changed through the existing paradigms. Thus, they seek to shock the system from the outside. If you create a situation where they can affect change, rather than drawing inward or excluding themselves, or like Tarek said, going silent because they're afraid that actually even being a Labour Party activist is going to lead to being placed on an MI5 radar, then you're actually going to create the conditions which are going to lead to a higher propensity of risk of violence rather than less. So I would say the actual simple answer is to have more radicalism. Now that's controversial coming from a brown Muslim bearded male, but actually that's the truth. We need more radicalism, not less.
Thank you, Rizwan. And thank you, Tarek and John. It's been really interesting listening to you, and unfortunately Peter had to go. And of course, Loki, thank you for your contribution. Please do follow us. I think our Twitter's up there, at SOAS ICOP, so we can keep you informed about more of these events that we do. Please try to continue to come in person. I know we've got live stream viewers today, but we do want people to actually come into SOAS as well for future events. So thank you very much to our audience, and have a good night.